Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Jeremy Lent, who's a writer and founder and president of the nonprofit Leology Institute, dedicated to fostering a worldview that could enable humanity to thrive sustainably on the earth. The Leology Institute, www.leology.org, which integrates systems science and ancient wisdom traditions, holds regular workshops and other events in the San Francisco Bay Area. Lent is the author of the novel Requiem of the Human Soul, and formerly he was founder, CEO, and chairman of a publicly traded internet company. Lent holds a BA in English Literature from Cambridge and an MBA from the University of Chicago. Jeremy, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
The book, The Patterning Instinct, A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, integrates so much eclectic knowledge of anthropology and archaeology and science and psychology and linguistics and behavioral science, and I'm just amazed that someone with an MBA is doing stuff like this.
Yes, well, it's certainly a change in kind of focus in my life that led to the writing of this book, and it was really actually a result of that kind of change in my life that led to the book in the first place. Because, as you mentioned, the subtitle of the book is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning, and truly, it was my own search for meaning that led me to the kind of research that ended up causing me to write the book. Mm-hmm. So as you mentioned, I had done an MBA and I had a career in business and started and took public an internet company. And then things happened in my life that caused the sort of structures of my life to kind of crash somewhat. My wife, at the time, she passed away some years back, she became seriously ill, and I left the company to look after her, and then the company itself was really one of these young internet companies that collapsed then a year or two later. And I found myself in this place in my life where I wanted to make sure that whatever I did next in my life was truly meaningful to me. But then I asked myself, well, what does that mean? What does meaning really mean? And I didn't want to take just somebody else's word for it. Mm-hmm. So I started this own search for meaning myself. And that led me to kind of peel the onion, if you will, to try to understand where these ideas that we're told are the source of meaning come from. And it was a long journey over a number of years. And it was really only after a few years I'd been doing my own research, I realized it would be so great if somebody could have had actually written a book that would have helped me to sort of navigate my own search. And I realized, well, since I couldn't find that book out there, why don't I just do it myself? Mm-hmm. And that began this journey.
Yeah, I had to look up Leology, and I actually went to your website. Li is a Chinese word for the organizing principle, and we'll talk some about that. And ology, of course, is the study of that organizing principle. That may well be a part of our discussion if we get to China. But I want to start with the hominids' migration out of Africa. And let's begin there in terms of how our history was shaped. So
sure.
The hominids, the Homo sapiens that started out in Africa, migrated to Eurasia and spread out all over, and that was one of the first influences on shaping our history.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, modern findings in anthropology, and especially using genetics, has discovered some amazing things about this out of Africa story. And one is that it was actually a very, very small group of humans, or as you say, actually hominids, who made it out of Africa at that time. And in fact, the ones we're talking about were modern humans, were genetically modern humans. But what makes that so interesting is that actually there is more genetic diversity within the people who live now in Africa than all of the rest of the world, because essentially there was just this kind of this small number of people who actually ended up populating the rest of the world, Asia, Europe, and the Americas and Australia. So that's a fascinating thing. But, something that I found so interesting as we look at those early kind of incursions of humans into the rest of the world, we tend to think of the hunter-gatherer period in human history as being one that was kind of in harmony, if you will, with the natural world. And in many ways, that's true. And I discussed that in some detail and how the hunter-gatherer worldview really saw themselves as being really a part of nature. But at the same time, because of the human power over the environment as a result of what I call the patterning instinct, the ability to make sense of the world in a way that other animals don't, there was this imbalance in power between humans and the rest of nature. So you saw these significant extinctions of big animals, what are called megafauna, in every single one of the new continents that humans arrived in. And I think there's a lesson there for us to learn about the human impact on the natural world.
Mm-hmm. And this nomadic nature of the hunter-gatherers was such that when they would hunt a species to extinction, they would just move on to somewhere else, right?
Yes, and I think the important thing is to realize that when they did that, they didn't even realize that they were doing it. Because even though when we look back in history and we see extinction of species concentrated over a period of maybe a couple of thousand years, when you look at the big picture of history, that's like just a blip in time. But if you're just one generation of hunter-gatherers, you don't really notice, and maybe the sort of grandfather said, oh, there were more of that animal in my time, and with the young people, we even take that seriously. And so that's, I think, a part of what we need to understand in these kind of imbalances that humans have with the natural world, is we have what's actually called shifting baseline syndrome, which is even a modern experience. That's a word that actually just that's a phrase that got constructed just recently about fishing in the modern world. But there's this way in which each generation thinks that what it's looking at is just normal, is how it's always been. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a critical lesson to learn.
And you trace through some of that history and emergence of how cultures shaped perceptions of reality for various groups. But let's start with these tribal hunter-gatherers and how they explained how the world worked. There were different versions, but a lot of them have some commonalities, and it has to do with how there's energy, life force in everything.
Yes, that's true. And because you'd think, well, hunter-gatherers living, say, in the jungle or tropical forests of Amazon have got to have a very different worldview than those living on plains, or others living maybe up in the Arctic Circle. And yet what you find is that in spite of these differences in the environment, there were some fundamental elements of understanding the relationship of the natural world that was true for every one of our ancestors, no matter where they were in the world. And that's probably the most important thing, is what you just said, the sense that everything is alive. There's spirits in everything around us. And there was a sense that humans were really just part of that. There was very little sense of humans being separate or different from the rest of the natural world, but that humans had spirits just like other creatures had spirits. And shamanism was a practice that was ubiquitous in hunter-gatherer systems everywhere around the world, which was certain people who got into a sort of trance state in order to kind of enter what was seen as a spirit world and really speak and connect with these deep spirits of nature and bring their findings back to their own group. And there was a sense that nature was really a family. The core metaphor, if you will, that hunter-gatherers used to make sense of the world was really nature as a giving parent, that there was this intimate relationship with the spirits. There wasn't so much of a fear as more of a sense of family. Nature was there to give.
Mm-hmm. And I found the part about the Aborigines of Australia interesting in terms of understanding the world having been brought into being by creative entities called dreamings.
Yes, and they are really the Aboriginals in Australia are so important to study because of course, we can't know exactly what has changed in some of these mythic ways of understanding the universe over thousands of years, but we can have a sense that when we look at modern hunter-gatherer societies, we can really get a feeling of some of the ways in which our early human ancestors around the world saw things. And this sense of the creative spirits traveling around the universe and kind of putting their kind of spiritual understanding into things, and that being connected with the modern world, is a sense that you see, again, everywhere in different hunter-gatherer cultures around the world, a sense of sort of how things can transform, but the spirits are always there.
Mm-hmm. Now, we talk about dualism in the book, and I'm wondering if you would classify the shamanistic experience where they go into the spirit world as part of that dualistic view of the cosmos, where there's the material world and the spirit world. Are they separate, or are they one thing?
Dualism is one of these words that can be interpreted in very different ways, and so it is important to make a distinction that I make in the book. I try to make that in some detail. What is true is that humans, ever since we developed a way of thinking about the world and thinking about ourselves with language and with conceptual consciousness, have always had this sense of a certain kind of spirit world that was not the same as the day-to-day material world. But in earlier times, such as those hunter-gatherer period, which actually accounted for about 95% of human history, even though there was a spirit world, it was seen as being kind of quasi-material. It wasn't the sense of something that was utterly abstract. It was a sense that, well, it was kind of spiritual and different, but it had a certain element of tangible quality to it. So in ancient Chinese ideas, for example, spirits were believed to have some sort of material essence, which over a few generations would sort of fade away. But they weren't completely abstract. And it was really only the first time in human history that the idea of a completely, purely abstract, non-material world existed. We see that arise about 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, where over a few generations, philosophers started to come up with this notion that there was some other dimension to the universe that was purely abstract, absolutely unchanging, and that was where that was where this kind of modern dualistic way of thinking set in, which sees a transcendent dimension different from the material world, and sees humans, or at least until recent times, saw humans as having a purely a sort of eternal soul that was absolutely immaterial, separate from the body.
Mm-hmm. And with regard to culture, you mentioned that 95% of human history is of this type living. You know, the foragers, the nomads, and they didn't have a family unit like we know today in our heteronormative, monotheistic world. It was more like a tribal family, and so partners may have been sexually liberated, children may not have obeyed their parents, stuff like that comes out in some of your descriptions here.
Yes, it is. It's an interesting thing to get a feeling for. And I think the most important elements to get from that understanding of those early hunter-gatherer ways of living was the idea of boundaries being fluid. So it's not like the sort of hunter-gatherer band would be this sort of one gigantic, kind of free sex sort of community, which some people maybe might imagine. I mean, there were you would have pairings of male and female who would bond together and have children and raise a family, and they'd be part of the overall bigger sort of family or band, hunter-gatherer band, which might have been maybe anything from 50 to maybe a couple of hundred people in size. But the thing is that these boundaries were fluid, so it wasn't this fixed, like here's a marriage and that's the way it should always be. So one of the partners might go off and get together with somebody else in the tribe, and that wouldn't be this disaster. It might be a little bit disturbing for a while, but then things would restabilize again. Mm-hmm. And that was how the hunter-gatherers saw everything in their life. Because they were nomadic, there was no sense of physical boundaries as they traveled around, and virtually everything that they sort of took, that they understood the world as, had these kind of amorphous sort of moving boundaries. And that's why, children as they grew up, they may listen to their parents, but there was none of this sort of strict father syndrome, if you will, where they had to do exactly what they were told or there'd be this terrible punishment. Mm-hmm. And there was more of a sense of kind of fluidity in these relationships.
Mm-hmm. And let's shift to the last 5%, because one of the things, and I've gotten this from several authors on our show, the most transformative event of human history was probably the shift from hunter-gatherer to agrarian societies. That was like just changed the world.
Yes, that I think that is just so true. The only thing I would add as a little bit of a precursor to that is probably the most significant shift that really enabled us to have human culture the way we have was the emergence of language itself, mm-hmm. At the very kind of dawn of the sort of human experience, if you will. So that was hugely a major transition. But from that point on, yes, I think the rise of agriculture absolutely transformed the human experience. Because with the rise of agriculture, and really in a way it was more what they call sedentism rather than agriculture itself that made the biggest change. The notion of humans settling in one place as opposed to being nomadic. And that's correlated a lot with agriculture. But there's a few societies where you see them settling down in one place, even still foraging, and you still see some of these changes in the human experience at that point. Mm-hmm. And some of these important changes are things like, for the first time, the idea of ownership comes into play. As you settle, you want to sort of accumulate possessions more. And then when you do work in agriculture and, sow your crops in a field, and you start to put out boundaries. So suddenly fences come up, and people say, well, this is mine, that's not yours, I worked on this space. And then if you get extra crops one year, you might then want to store that for the next year. When you're a nomadic forager, there's no such concept as storage. So the whole notion of future and past begins to change. And along with storage comes inequalities. Some people get to be lucky, maybe a little bit harder working than others, and then they get to accumulate more possessions. And with that, of course, they want to, as they get older, they want to make sure their possessions get passed down to the next generation. So then notions of, that's where notions of patriarchy and inheritance begin to set in. So many of the things that we take for granted in the human experience only arose with this rise in agriculture about 12,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And that also led to hierarchies that didn't exist in the hunter-gatherer culture, and that not only hierarchies of society, but hierarchies of deities.
Yes, and that's so interesting, because yes, hunter-gatherer society is fundamentally egalitarian, and that is where I think we have this deeply rooted human instinct for fairness, in the sense that when we see these massive inequalities in society now, there's this deeply embedded sense that that's wrong in some fundamental way, and that's where we get that from. But exactly as you say, when agrarian culture developed, as we started to have hierarchies in human society, and you had some priest or then some king and then some sort of remote king that you'd never even got to see, but you heard that they were so powerful. People began to assume and sort of make sense of the cosmos that it followed similar patterns to that human relationship. So you start to see for the first time these kind of high gods that people had to pray to through a priesthood. We kind of lost this intimate relationships with the spirit world that hunter-gatherers had. And along with that came this idea of sacrifice. So as agrarian, imagine working in the fields, and you have to put all this hard work in to kind of sow the crops and do the weeding and everything in order to get food to put on the table. So it was natural to assume that the same must be true in your relationship with the gods up there in the heavens. So for the first time in human history, the sense of sacrificing to the gods came into play.
Mm-hmm. And we'll fast forward a little bit here because I do want to get this distinction of Greece versus China, Greece and India to some extent versus China. So we get to ancient Greece, and the title of the first chapter is The Birth of Dualism in Ancient Greece. And
right.
The value they placed on intellectual pursuits was very interesting as well. How can we summarize that neatly?
I know, there's some big issues there. So what we see we see some ideas arising in ancient Greece that really formed the foundation of European and Western thought, which now has become so sort of globally endemic that many of us just assume that these are some of the ways in which people have always made sense of things. But that's actually not the case. It's only unique to this one branch of sort of meaning-making in human history. So one incredibly important element there was that some of these ancient Greek philosophers began to see and really developed this notion of a split cosmos and a split human being. So when they thought of the cosmos, they began to get the sense that there was this material world here, which was kind of polluted and couldn't be trusted, and things sort of went bad and could never stay the same. But there was some transcendent world in another dimension, which was an ideal version of this world. And along with that, they saw the human being, rather than being this kind of integrated sort of entity, they saw the human being as fundamentally split. So this notion of a sort of somewhat intangible spirit became this idea of this absolutely abstract soul that was really, and that soul really belonged in that ideal world of transcendence. And the soul was imprisoned in this body. And so they began to be this kind of distaste, almost hate for the body, and emotions along with that, as being this stuff that kind of polluted the soul. And the soul was connected up with this notion of pure intellect. So you see this split then between reason as the kind of the domain of the intellect, and emotions and bodily feelings that have become structural to so much of how we understand the world now. But you don't see that in other cultures, this kind of split between reason and emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are some of the fundamental building blocks that we inherited from ancient Greece.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention the influence on the scientific method of research and all that brought to this world as a result.
Exactly. Yeah, and just to add, like, something that's so interesting there is that I don't want to give this sense that this split I'm talking about is all something that's necessarily just all bad. That split led to this development of reason and this development of intellectual thought that allowed the scientific revolution to take place, and so many of the wonderful things that we enjoy right now in the world. But it did have some negative elements to it that I think have become increasingly important to understand in the modern world.
Mm-hmm. And if we turn our attention to India and divinity and dualism in India, there are connections to the way Greeks viewed the cosmos.
Yes, and that is something that I find so fascinating, because even scholars, so many people who look at these sort of ancient cultures remain unaware of how much linkage there is between ancient Indian and ancient Greek culture. And if you sort of go back in time, you see that there's really two branches from the same core root, or sort of core trunk, if you will, of thinking, which came, interestingly, from tribes of horsemen, known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, who originally developed their culture on the steppes, or sort of north of the Caspian and the Black Seas, in what's now Russia. And what's so interesting there is that these horsemen, who were illiterate, they didn't even have writing, but they had this. They were really the first people to develop more of a kind of a dualistic way of thinking about the world, and they actually migrated and conquered the indigenous tribes of India, and they also migrated to ancient Greece, and they were the forebears of the people who developed that thinking in ancient Greece. And you see incredible similarities in certain splits, again, between notion of mind and body, and the body being polluted, and this sense of a transcendent world out there and a material world that can't really be trusted. You see so many of these similarities in ancient Indian and Greek thought.
By contrast, dualism didn't seem to impact ancient China. They followed the Tao and the interplay of energies between the yin and yang, and it was a whole different concept of the cosmos.
Yes, that's right. And that's one of the core themes that we see in the book, because, as anyone listening is beginning to get the sense, the book really looks at how different cultures evolved all the way from earliest times to the present day. And a big chunk of the book looks at these two parallel developments of thought in East Asia, and particularly China, and contrasted to what was in the West. And as you say, in China, what we see is more of an unbroken development from the original hunter-gatherer ethos of everything being connected, leading to this agrarian set of values that we were just describing before. But in traditional China, because you didn't have this dualistic split, as philosophers and sages developed really complex and deeply thought out ways to understand the universe, they looked at things from that core underlying sense of things still being ultimately connected. So they had this kind of notion of the universe being essentially like a web of life. And you can imagine a spider's web, where you just sort of touch one element of the web and everything reverberates throughout. And they sort of saw all of nature in that way, and they saw humans as being part of that natural web rather than separate from it, which is what you begin to see in Western thought. Mm-hmm. So I think that this understanding of how East Asian philosophers made sense of the universe is a very valuable contrast with our what so many of the ideas we take for granted in Western thought.
We've only scratched the surface of what is a very rich book and a fascinating read. We're getting near the end of our time, and that's too bad because we haven't even begun to discuss monotheism and its impact on the world. One of the claims in the book, it's really interesting to read, is how much monotheism affected persecution of other people who didn't believe as they thought they should. And but this book has left me wanting more. And so The Patterning Instinct is the book. It's by Jeremy Lent. It's a great read, and I hope you'll pick up a copy. I remind our listeners that if you don't hear the program on our regularly scheduled time, you can catch up with us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. That's our channel now. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.